Greetings, fellow scientists. My name is Jesse Searcy, and I'm a manager of outreach programs and our Go Code program at the Saskatchewan Science Centre. Today, we have an amazing guest joining us for a really cool interview through the power of the internet. This is Lucija Prelovets. She is a science producer and communications officer at Ocean School. Through her work at Ocean School, she gets to teach about oceans and engage people in critical thinking and environmental awareness. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about the ocean.
Yeah. And like for us in Saskatchewan, I think this is a really cool topic because we don't always get to like necessarily see large bodies of water. So this is a really important thing for, I think, a lot of our visitors and viewers to actually learn more about.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I want to ask you is, why is it important for people to be studying oceans?
Well, one thing is that we don't know much about the ocean. I think we've only explored about 5% of the ocean. So there's definitely a lot out there that we still need to be exploring and learning about. And it's really important because the ocean is 70% of our planet. And we want to be able to figure out the best ways to help protect the ocean because there's a lot of threats against the ocean right now. And being able to learn more about it and study it can give us kind of the most efficient ways and the best ways we can protect the ocean, the animals in the ocean, the seaweed in the ocean, learn more about our planet and how to be able to go against things like climate change. So the ocean is a very key factor in all of this.
Yeah. And I think like for people in Saskatchewan, it's really cool to like learn about the ocean in ways because for them, like I said, it's so like distant. But you kind of touched on it there, but like, why should people in Saskatchewan really care about it? Like if we were to accidentally spill something dangerous into our water system, how does that affect the ocean?
It's a great question. So all bodies of water on whatever land will eventually lead to the ocean. It's sometimes a very long way to get to the ocean, but they'll eventually get there. So even in Saskatchewan, you are in 3 different watersheds. So depending where in Saskatchewan you are, but like the Saskatchewan River will eventually lead into the Hudson's Bay, which is part of the ocean. Another part of Saskatchewan, you can actually go all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So it goes all the way through the States and all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico. And then you can also end up all the way in the Arctic Ocean. So any little impact that we do, if we dump gas, if we're cleaning your car or something and oil comes out of your car, it goes down your drainage system, that goes into your streams, which go through rivers and lakes, and then those rivers will all lead back to the ocean. So it's really important to think about those little impacts that we do every day, especially what going into our water. And the ocean does impact you, even though it's really far away. So let's take one deep breath together. We'll go. And that breath came from like trees and land and everything. We take another deep breath. We go. That's from the ocean. So the ocean actually provides 50% of the oxygen that we breathe because there's so much life in the ocean. There's phytoplankton, algae, all producing oxygen that we're breathing. So it helps us breathe. A lot of the stuff that we use every single day comes from shipping that across the ocean. So phones, all those pieces come from all different countries around the world and end up in our homes. We eat some of the stuff all because it comes through the ocean. And then speaking of food, seafood. People really like seafood. So that's another way the ocean impacts you. And even if you don't like seafood, you're probably eating seafood, you don't even realize it. Jesse, did you know that there is algae in your ketchup?
Oh, actually, that's completely news to me.
It's true. Seaweed has different properties in it that can actually help thicken food. So they use it as a thickener and a stabilizer for things like ketchup, mayonnaise. You can find it in peanut butters too, even in ice cream. So there you go. So you got some algae, you got some kelp in your pantry that you're not even aware of. So we use the ocean in ways that we don't even know.
Interesting. Well, yeah. Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to be immediately going through everything in my pantry and like looking through.
Yeah, look for things like alginate, carrageenan, and beta carotene.
Interesting. Oh man,
Mm-hmm.
Gives me something to do after this. So here in Canada, we're surrounded by three different oceans. We have the Pacific on our west coast, we have the Arctic to our north, and where you work at Ocean School is out on the east coast. And you guys do a lot of information and education about the Atlantic Ocean. Could you tell us a little bit about what makes the North Atlantic Ocean so interesting?
For sure. So behind me, I am currently in this image and currently at Fogo Island in Newfoundland. And Newfoundland is as far east as Canada as you can go. So it's kind of way out there in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's actually one of the reasons why the North Atlantic is so special. Newfoundland is known for its cod industry. So people were fishing for cod from Newfoundland for decades and centuries. And they fished it so much that they actually had to stop fishing it in the early 90s because it's been overfished so much. But it's kind of put Canada on the map. A lot of people around the world, especially in Europe, know Canada for our cod industry. So cod has been a very important part of Canadian history and is a very important part of the North Atlantic Ocean. Another cool part of the Atlantic Ocean and a part of Halifax history is actually the Titanic. So the Atlantic Ocean is kind of like the gateway from Europe coming into Canada. And as we know, the Titanic sunk in the Atlantic. And not that far from Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, from Halifax, the first ships were sent out there to actually collect those that were on the Atlantic. So it became a really big part of Canadian history. And my favorite part of the North Atlantic is actually these tiny little islands, about 9 of them, in the middle, called the Azores. And a lot of people know about Hawaii, which is a beautiful island in the Pacific Ocean, and there's plenty of other tiny islands throughout the Pacific, but not many people know about the tiny islands in the Atlantic Ocean. And the Azores is pretty much kind of like the Atlantic version of Hawaii. They're all volcanic islands. They're along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is where 2 of the tectonic plates have met. And they're really fascinating. I was lucky enough to go visit them last year. And I fell in love with these tiny islands that are kind of a sanctuary for a lot of whales come visit them, because around islands you'll get a lot of fish and more animals living just because there's more nutrients around those islands. And so whales will come and feed there. And then with whales come a lot of other animals. Birds are coming flying around, and then the people come. And then we end up on these gorgeous little islands. So that's some of the reasons I think the North Atlantic is so special. And the whales, I think, have a lot to do with, especially the North Atlantic right whale has been in the news a lot in the past few years. There's actually only about 400 of them left in the North Atlantic. And they come up to Canada every summer. And unfortunately, in 2017, they went to an area that they don't usually go to visit. And so the fishermen that were working there weren't prepared. So there's a lot of deaths for these whales because they kept getting caught in fishing traps and they kept getting hit by boats. But since then, fishermen in Canada and in the States have kind of come together to help reduce their fishing gear that's in the water, to help reduce entanglements. And the North Atlantic right whale is, I think this year they've had 10 calves born that they were able to see. So they're kind of very slowly, hopefully, making a comeback. And that's a very, I think, unique story for the North Atlantic. For the right whales are really special.
Cool. So when we talk about like the different kinds of studies that you can do on the North Atlantic or any ocean really, what are some challenges that scientists are currently facing in regards to researching aquatic life?
That's a good question. It's one of the reasons I went into ocean sciences, because I loved the ocean. I loved learning about the ocean, and I decided, I was like, I'm going to study whales. But then I came to realize that studying whales is very competitive and it's very expensive, which is the big problem across of all ocean research. The cost. Marine research is really expensive. Depending on what you're doing, you either need a boat to go out there and look for whatever animals you're doing or whatever samples you're taking, or you need to do this all in a lab. So that means you need to have a big tank set up. You have to have flow systems going in, saltwater, freshwater, depending what ecosystem you're studying. So the costs add up very quickly. And if you're on the boat, on the water with a boat, you have to have your crew, and then sometimes you have to go underwater. So there's different ways of doing that. And that's one of the hardest things, is definitely all those costs adding up quickly. And especially if you're going underwater, the deeper you go, the more challenging it gets. There'll be less light, there's more pressure, and it gets a lot colder. So sometimes people will go with scuba gear. You can go with underwater robots or remotely operated vehicles called ROVs to explore what's in the deep, or you can go with submarines. But once again, all those things, the costs add up very quickly, so it's really hard to be able to research the ocean. And it's just a very challenging environment. The ocean, there's storms, there's big waves. A lot of times, people or researchers can't go out for weeks at a time because of bad weather. So it definitely has a lot more challenges than you'll find in certain on-land habitats, which I think is one of the reasons why we know so little about the ocean, and we're still trying to learn more about it. But as technology gets better, we're able to explore more and more, which is really encouraging.
Yeah. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but like when we talk about things that affect the oceans, and we'd mentioned a little bit about pollution earlier, what is one thing that you think that all people, whether it's in Canada or countries around the world, could do that would be really impactful and beneficial to help out ocean life?
That's a really important question, because there's so many things we as humans can do, but it's really hard to pinpoint kind of important ones that would actually make the most impact. And I don't know about you, but I hear this one a lot. It's reducing how much plastic you use. Just as simple as that, because unfortunately there is a lot of plastic in our oceans that ends up from us. So even if, like we said earlier, how stuff you put in the water can end up in the ocean, even little things like a plastic bottle or even a bottle cap or even something smaller than that can make its way down the ocean, make its way into the water, and then animals will start to eat it. So those plastic pieces will break up into microplastics, and a lot of times whales that are coming through, they're taking big gulps of water to collect tiny little plankton animals, and in those big gulps is little tiny plastic, so they end up eating pieces of plastic that accumulate. So a lot of times when whales wash up dead on the beaches, if scientists can get there in time, they'll do a necropsy and kind of determine why the whale has died. So when they open up this whale, they actually will find the stomach contents of the whale is mostly plastic at this point, which is really sad, because that means these whales, they feel full because their stomachs are full, but they're actually not getting any nutrients. They're actually starving, and they're not even aware. And it's not just the whales. Seabirds have full of plastic. Turtles, always hear them, they like to eat jellyfish, they end up eating plastic bags. All these animals end up eating this plastic and dying from it. And then a lot of times we will eat these animals. So like if a small fish eats some plastic, a bigger fish eats that, like a salmon, and we end up eating the salmon. And it's still such a new thing that we don't know the impacts of on a human, what would it be eating animals that had been contaminated with plastics, because there are chemicals in there. So it is something that we should all kind of do our part to help reduce plastic, whether that being going to the grocery store, bring your own bags, bring your own produce bags, reusable water bottles, saying no to simple things like straws, coffee cups, bringing your own when you go get coffee, even kind of making your own, you can make your own granola or your own types of cereal, making your own bread. All these different things help reduce how much waste we are producing, because it does spread around the world. We always heard about the great garbage patch that's in the Pacific. There's another garbage patch also in the Atlantic Ocean. And when I was actually in the Azores, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, we did a beach cleanup while I was there, and we actually found lobster tags from New Jersey, which was pretty crazy to think that it traveled across the ocean to the small island, and we're now cleaning it up. So it's definitely, I think, a simple choice, but a really important one. And being able to not just recycle, but just to say no to the plastic outright and not even introduce it into your system, as your like recycling system, is really important.
So if this was a little bit of a more like really serious kind of question, let's head to a little bit more of a lighthearted question. I want to know a little bit more about your interests. What would you say your favorite ocean animal is, and what makes that animal so interesting?
So I had to break this up into categories because I can't choose one favorite ocean animal. I find it really hard. So first off, my favorite invertebrates, so animals without any backbones. It covers a lot. Most of the animals in the ocean are invertebrates. But my favorite one is, it changed a lot, but right now it's the octopus. I think octopus are so cool. They blow my mind. They are actually considered the smartest of all invertebrates, which is pretty crazy to say because something like a sea cucumber is also an invertebrate, which you wouldn't really, it just kind of sits there. You know, it doesn't do as much as an octopus. There's a whole wide range of differences in invertebrates, but octopus, they have, they're really smart. They can open jars. When I worked at the aquarium, they would actually put treats for the octopus inside of like peanut butter jars, or even those medicine jars for kids that are childproof. They would put them in those snacks in there, and the octopus could figure out how to open a jar, which is so cool. And they can also use tools. There's an octopus that actually will hide inside a coconut shell in the ocean to camouflage itself from its predators, which is beyond amazing. And there's something called the mimic octopus, which will make itself look like other animals. It can make itself look like a stingray or a lionfish. It can, and it blows my mind that I can actually see an animal and be like, I'm going to make myself look like that guy. It does it. And it just, they're amazing animals. They can see really well. They camouflage experts. They're really hard to spot, and they can change colors and even textures of their skin really easily.
Oh, wow.
So by far my favorite is, yeah, the octopus. They are, just look them up. They're really cool. You watch octopus videos all day. And then I have my favorite fish, I would say, is the whale shark. They are the biggest fish in the ocean. And they're just so massive with their huge mouths, but so adorable. And they're just filter feeders, and people are really scared of them because they're sharks, but they don't eat fish. They just eat tiny little animals, little plankton. And they're super cool. And I'd love to swim with one day. That's kind of my dream.
That's on your bucket list?
Whale sharks. Yeah, for sure. And then my favorite mammal, it flip-flops between manatees and orcas, which are both very different mammals in the ocean. Manatees are really chill. They eat seaweed. They just float in the grass and chomp on seaweed, versus orcas, who are the top predators in the ocean, are very smart. Different orcas in different areas of the world have different ways to hunt. They can either come up onto a beach and grab a seal. They can sometimes throw a dolphin into the air and come up and grab it that way. They can use bubbles to shock the animals before they eat them. So orcas, and they all have their own languages depending what pod they're living in. So they're pretty awesome animals as well. So those are my favorite ocean animals. So not just one, because it's so hard to choose. There's so many awesome things in the ocean.
It was a very open question, so that maybe wasn't very fair.
It's very broad. There's a lot of cool things living in the ocean.
Now that we've talked about like a lot of the surface of the ocean and the North Atlantic there, how about we talk a little bit about the deepest parts of the ocean? Could you tell us a little bit about how deep the actual ocean could go, as well as like what kind of things live down there in the deeps?
Yeah, so the deepest part of the ocean that we have so far found is called the Challenger Deep. It's part of the Marianas Trench, and then there's like a dip that's called the Challenger Deep, and it's about, I wrote down this number so don't get it wrong, they think it's about 10,984 meters, which is about almost 11 kilometers down. So it's very deep, and definitely what we think is the deepest part. And it's in the Pacific Ocean, close to Guam, and kind of between Guam and Japan, which is personally for me very hard to imagine where that is in the world, but that's the general location of the Challenger Deep. And because we don't know that much about the ocean, we could go deeper. We haven't, if it does, we haven't found that yet, but this has been, I think, for I think it was found very early on that this was the deepest part of the ocean. So this is what we're sticking with for now until maybe in 5, 10, 15 years, we get better technology and we're able to map the ocean more accurately and we can actually find deeper spots, which is pretty cool. On average, though, the ocean isn't usually that deep. On average, it's about almost, oh, I lost that number. Oh, there it is, 3,600 meters deep. So that's kind of the average depth the ocean is across the Atlantic, Arctic, Pacific Oceans are as well. And cool things you can find down there. So animals in the deep ocean have to have really special adaptations because, like I said earlier, the ocean, there's a lot of pressure down there. So a lot of pressure pushing in on them. And it's very cold and it's very dark. Once you reach a certain depth, there's absolutely no light. So a lot of these animals, some of them don't have eyes or they're just blind because there's no point in having eyes when you're living in the dark. But the ones that do have eyes, they are attracted to light. So animals like, if you've seen like Finding Nemo, the anglerfish, he's the guy that has a little bulb hanging from the top of his head. He uses light to attract other animals. So if an animal is in the dark and you see a light, you're like, oh, there's something cool there. They rush over and that's when he eats them. So they use light to be able to grab their animals. And then other animals, they have very different, I guess, bone structure than other fish that are higher up because they have pressure, because the pressure is so intense and pushing on them, they don't need to have very rigid skeletons. So they're pretty floppy. And there's a popular fish called the blobfish, which only has its name as blobfish because once they caught it and they brought him up to the surface, he was literally kind of like a useless blob. He didn't do much, didn't look like much because there was no pressure on him anymore. It was a lot less pressure at the surface than all the way at the bottom. And then the deepest animal that we found so far was living in the Marianas Trench. It was called the Mariana snailfish, which is a small little fish, and it was actually found at almost 8 kilometers down, which is pretty cool. It's just pretty deep for an animal to live. And then a lot of times you'll hear about tube worms, which they live at hydrothermal vents. And hydrothermal vents are essentially underwater volcanoes. And these people didn't think any animal could survive there because there was no oxygen. But they actually found these tube worms that have bacteria in their bodies that can actually turn the chemicals around them into food for the animal to eat and digest, which is so crazy how all these animals have adapted to living down in these deep parts of the ocean. And we didn't even think that anything was down there, but there's life.
Cool. Yeah. Like, and if you really think about it, like that's so far down that like you had mentioned, the pressure and everything like that alone is something that's like a huge hurdle to actually overcome, especially for humans. That's like insane that we would ever be able to deal with that pressure outside of a mechanical device.
They actually went down into the submarine, into the Challenger Deep with a submarine. It was actually the director who directed Titanic. He went down into the Challenger Deep. I can't remember what year, but that's the only way that humans are able to explore. Like you said, you have to go inside of a machine or send a robot down there and take video for us. That's the only way we can actually see what's happening down there.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the deep parts of the ocean. We started talking a little bit about adaptations. What adaptations do you find that aquatic animals develop that differ to what land-based animals would develop? And how does that help them survive?
Mm-hmm. So there's definitely a lot of unique adaptations for these animals in the ocean. So for example, the easiest one is breathing. They can't have lungs like we do, or certain adaptations that invertebrates have to help them breathe. They all developed gills to help them breathe. So instead of, they can actually take oxygen right out of the water through their gills into the bloodstreams, which is pretty efficient. So that's one way. Being able to move in the ocean. So if you're a fish, you have fins, you have a tail to help you propel yourself. If you're a whale, same thing. You have your fish, or you have your fins and tail Other invertebrates have like shrimp. They have tiny little legs that are swimming, and actually a lot of them have kind of like a paddle shape on them, so they helps them kind of move. Like if you're ever doing dog paddling in the water, helps them move through the water that way. Other animals like snails or sea urchins, they actually have little suction cups to them that help them stick to stuff, because if you're stuck to a rock, you get big waves coming through that can probably rip you off that rock. This will actually help you stay on there. So they have to have adaptations to help them stick really well. And then for fish, they have to be able to stay afloat. They want to be able to control their buoyancy, so how high or low they're going in the water. So a lot of them have something called a swim bladder, which is basically a specialized organ they developed that holds air and can kind of contract or release and remove air when needed to be able to kind of go up and down. Sharks have developed a special thing called, they have a really oily liver that actually helps them float. So if you ever put oil on water, you'll see that the oil floats on top of the water. That's kind of the whole concept behind the shark's oily liver. It actually helps them stay afloat that way. And then their skin, they all have to have very different skin from us. So whales are mammals, just like us. They don't have any fur. Actually, baby dolphins, when they're born like a tiny little mustache, but it falls off within the first few days, because the fur would actually slow them down if they had any sort of fur or hair on their bodies. So they're hairless. They have smooth skin. It makes them help them be streamlined, so they're super fast. So sharks have specialized skin that's actually made out of tiny little teeth that are kind of lined up all over the skin to make them go super fast. And different animals use their skin to help them breathe. They can breathe through their skin as well. So there's a whole variety of different adaptations that these guys had to develop in the ocean. And then they came out on land, and then the mammals returned back into the ocean, so they had to redevelop all these different adaptations.
Cool. So one of my favorite aquatic animals when I was in university learning about was, I actually learned quite a bit about the mantis shrimp.
Oh yes.
Because like they're an incredible species. Like they can see colors we can't even imagine. They can punch, or they can create forces that are like extreme forces. What would you think the most unique or most interesting aquatic adaptation that you can think of is?
That is such a challenging question, because there's so many cool adaptations. Like I was thinking about the mantis shrimp, but since you mentioned that one, I don't have to go into that one. I think, once again, this might go back to my bias of my favorite animals, but camouflage. So like octopus, cuttlefish, the way that they camouflage and the way they can change the color of their skin, I find is super unique. They don't use it just to camouflage. Cuttlefish actually use them to communicate. So if they ever feel threatened, they can actually throw pulses of color over their skin in a way to telling you, like, hey, back off. And then if you don't, that's when they kind of squirt out that ink to be able to get away. But just that being able to camouflage, and I've seen octopus and cuttlefish when I've been swimming in the sea, and they're so hard to catch. I can only notice them when they start moving, and I'm like, that piece of sand is moving in a weird way, and then I look at it more closely and you see that it's actually a cuttlefish. The fact that they're able to camouflage so easily and change the texture of their skin, I think, is a really unique adaptation, but it's only one of thousands of the animals in the ocean. I can go on and on about all the amazing adaptations the animals have. So I encourage everyone to kind of look up some, especially invertebrates. Invertebrates in the ocean have really cool adaptations to help them survive.
Cool. Well, I think that's about all the time that we have for today. Where can we find more information about the oceans and learn about new cool things?
So I'm going to plug Ocean School. That's a great resource. So Ocean School is actually an online educational resource. So we a collaboration with the National Film Board of Canada. So we go and we film in amazing locations like here in Fogo Island. And we create these videos that's free for anyone to use online, oceanschool.ca. It's available in French and English. You'll get cool, short, kind of documentary style videos. You'll get virtual reality, so you can kind of explore different areas. You can go swimming with a right whale in virtual reality, which is really cool. And we talk a lot about our first unit. We talk a lot about the North Atlantic. We talk about cod. We talk about the right whale. We talk about deep sea habitats and the technology you need to go explore them. And then most recently, we actually have a new unit out talking about marine migration. So we focus on the scalloped hammerhead shark, another really cool animal with a really cool adaptation with their eyes, be able to see 360 degrees around them basically at all times, which is really cool. So if you want to learn about sharks and how people are able to track sharks or any animal that's moving throughout the ocean, you can go check out marine migration at oceanschool.ca. But there are so many other amazing resources online to learn about the ocean. If another great one I like is Earth Echo. It's actually run by the grandkids of Jacques Cousteau. So they have the ocean love in their blood, and they have some really great online virtual resources that can be used. And within Canada, we have OceanWise, which is, they help run the Vancouver Aquarium, but they also have some amazing resources. And they talk a lot about sustainable seafood, which is also very important in order to keep a healthy ocean. But they're kind of the Pacific Coast version of ocean education here in Canada. And then there's endless sources. I like going to check out watching Blue World by David Attenborough. It's on Netflix. Great shows. Blue Earth. No, wait. Oh my gosh. Blue Earth.
It's on
Blue
Netflix.
It's on Netflix. It's with David Attenborough. It's great. I always confuse if it's Blue Earth or Blue World. Both results will either give you a documentary on Netflix or a dolphin organization in Croatia. It's one of the two. So Blue Earth, Blue World. But those are great movies. And they helped open up my eyes to different cool parts of the ocean. And there's a second series that's out as well that I highly recommend learning or watching, because David Attenborough's amazing and so great.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you guys are interested in learning about other kinds of things that are happening at the Saskatchewan Science Centre, you can visit sasksciencecentre.com and check out all the cool things that we have going on as well. Thank you so much to Lucija Prelovets for joining us for today's interview. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.